This game needs little introduction. Elden Ring is finally out, with developer From Software pushing itself to create a truly open world take on the Dark Souls concept. Our focus for today? Well, there's the technical side, of course, especially following up on the analysis we did on the network test beta last year. We've played much further into the game now, revealing new areas of the lands between, and letting us see the bigger picture. Looking just at the current gen consoles today, updated to patch 1.02, what's the best, smoothest way to play on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, or Series S? Are there any visual differences between them worth noting, or changes in Elden Ring's visual makeup since the network test? How do the frame rate and quality modes compare? And lastly, what of the issue of loading times? Well, we're ready to talk everything Elden Ring today, and to join me, we have John Linneman.
Hey Tom, it's good to be here, and yes, the video is finally completed. We've both played a lot of the game at this point. I know I certainly have, and there's a lot to discuss today because I think people have had many questions regarding the state of the game on console, why it is the way it is, and hopefully we can sort of address that and give some advice that should help people enjoy it more.
Yeah, and also worth noting that we did hold back on the analysis a couple of days longer just because we knew patch 1.02 was the day one patch, and we were encouraged by From Software to wait for that just in case there were optimizations. And well, as we'll see, I don't think it made a huge difference, but it made the most sense to wait just to make sure we had what you have on day one.
It's usually not an issue though. That's the weird thing. But in this case, it just turned out this way. So
yeah,
it's because usually these sorts of patches arrive either actually before day one.
Yeah, it's true.
Or or they actually tend to have real changes. But in this case, well, as you'll see, it didn't really do much.
I think it was optimistic thinking, wasn't it? We just really wanted it to happen.
So I think at the end of the video, we'll talk more about the actual game itself because I think we both have a lot to say. I do think they've solved some really interesting issues that I have with open world games. I think it plays very well, but also it's not for everyone, right?
No, not at all. It's a fantastic game, but I think the first subject we've really got to touch on, the thing everyone wants to know about, is the performance side, right?
Yeah, so the main thing here is when looking at a game like this, usually these days it's pretty easy to sort of pick any version and be relatively happy, but this time there was some concern. The network test was not great in terms of performance. None of the platforms ran quite right, and unfortunately that has translated into the final game. In fact, in some ways it's actually slower, which was a little bit of a surprise, something we'll get into as well. So yeah, I'm not the one actually doing the data. You're the one editing this video and doing all the capture. I'm just here to talk about it with you. So, but it's a game I was very hyped for. So I think like everybody else, I was faced with the problem: which version are we going to play? And based on the network test, I was kind of initially thinking, okay, the PS5 version was already close enough to 60, so maybe we'll go with that version. But it turns out it's not stable, and in fact, none of the current gen versions are stable.
No.
And that sort of presented a conundrum. So as we said in that article, there's essentially two options for those looking for stable frame rates, right? There's playing the PS4 Pro version on a PS5,
right?
Which is it's a weird thing to recommend, but that is an option. That's a very stable 60 frames per second, and we'll talk more about what you actually lose with that one later. And then the other option is specifically if you're playing on Xbox and you have a VRR capable display, then you can enjoy much more fluid performance without judder. Even though the actual frame rate is still what it is, it doesn't feel bad, essentially. VRR saves the day. Problem is, of course, in that case, you need a display that's capable of it. And because I have such a display with the LG CX OLED, I ended up personally going for the Xbox version, as I suggested on Twitter, and that's where I've been playing, and I have a lot of thoughts on that as well. Series X on an OLED screen with VRR, or any VRR display, honestly, is probably the best experience you can have at the moment, but even that has some caveats, right?
Yeah, it's not clear-cut, and it really does depend on whether you have that VR supporting display, which I don't, so I had to take the opposite tactic, and I've been playing mainly on PS5. All right, let's get into the performance talk. There are two modes here, and obviously Per console, 2 modes, and also on PlayStation 5 we got the option of playing on the PS4 app, which is worth considering on its own merits. So yeah, let's kick off first by looking at the frame rate mode on PS5 and Series X, and it's clear right away that 60 FPS is off the cards. A locked 60 is just not going to happen.
Yeah, it kind of opens with that small room. You get 60 for a second, and then as soon as you open the door, it's like, well, there it goes. And
welcome to Limgrave.
Yeah, exactly. It never really recovers, does it? So should we quickly mention the settings? Like, what is frame rate mode?
So the modes, obviously when you first boot the game, you've got 2 modes, the frame rate and the quality mode. There's not a huge amount between them in the core settings visually. The main thing is that they have different resolution targets. So obviously, if we bring up a 3-way between all the quality mode settings on the 3 consoles, PS5, Series X and S, we have a fixed 4K on PS5 and Series X. It never drops below that, it's just fixed 4K, and Series S has a fixed 1440p. And then you've got the the frame rate mode side, which is, again, dynamic 4K on PS5 and Series X instead of just fixed. And that means it can go down to 1512p on both those consoles. And Series S, on the other hand, is dynamic 1440p, where it can go down to 1792 by 1008. So the range is there.
So that's it. So they pretty much just adjust the resolution dynamically in frame rate mode, and you kind of see the result here. I think there have been some reports out there of certain versions having higher resolutions than others, and it's actually very difficult to say because in many like-for-like scenes, the PS5 would come out slightly ahead, but because it's so variable, I don't think you can actually say that one is better than the other, outside of the fact that when the frame rate's dropping a little bit more on one, you would expect the actual resolution to be lower. But it seems like they could actually go lower still based on the actual results here, huh?
There's definitely room to go lower, but in the cases where it's really dropping to like the 45 FPS line in frame rate mode, for example, it seems to be around 1512p. So
ultimately, resolution isn't that important here, and I think we both recommend, if you're going to play one of these versions, use the frame rate mode. It's definitely a lot smoother. I will say, however, regarding the performance here on Xbox, I did mention on Twitter setting your console to 60 Hz versus 120 Hz because it reduces overall persistence blur due to doubling of frames. It's a normal thing that happens when you run a 60 FPS game in a 120 Hz container. But in this case, I might actually retract that and say use the 120 Hz mode because at least on the LG screens, if you go under 40 frames per second in 120 Hz mode, you get low frame rate compensation.
Right.
And unfortunately, even in frame rate mode, Series X definitely does dip below 40 frames per second.
Oh gosh.
And yeah, some heavy scenes. So it is not, it's very all over the place. And VRR again completely helps. It feels pretty good, but you can definitely see when the frame rate drops below the 40 line. It's not too common, thankfully, but it does happen. So that's something I recommend as far as configuring your system. I haven't tested Series S though with this, but based on your numbers, it does seem to be relatively similar.
Yeah, pretty similar. And it will generally, obviously, be lower than Series X. I think the range would be like 40 to 60 FPS in the frame rate mode, and obviously worse still in the quality mode.
Actually, so quality mode is interesting then, isn't it? Because this actually does work with VRR if you use low frame rate compensation, so at 120 Hertz. And it's not too bad. It does feel similar enough to 30 FPS at times. But if you don't have such a display, it's absolutely awful. And you wonder why they didn't just, I was going to say they should implement a 30 FPS cap, but they actually don't know how to do that either. Because as we know from the base console versions, the incorrect frame pacing returns.
It's a lose-lose situation then there. And I think, what would you say, between bad frame pacing and an unlocked frame rate? I'd prefer the unlocked frame rate.
Yeah, I agree.
At least you got the option of VRR. Still, it's not an ideal situation, and Series S really does bear the brunt of it. It's unfortunate that it's called frame rate mode because it's not really performant in any way.
If you're not using a VRR screen, then it sounds like the PS5 version is the better option because the frame rate is generally, on average, a little higher. But we should talk about the PS4 Pro version running on PS5, I think.
Yeah.
Because this is the option that we uncovered in the network test and have talked about before. And if you don't have a VR display and you don't have an Xbox, this is actually the best way to play it.
Yeah, there's definitely some caveats in there, which basically boils down to the resolution side. Obviously, frame rate mode has the dynamic 4K, but on the PS4 app, it's using the PS4 Pro code path, which means you get kind of 1800p reconstructed checkerboard rendering by the looks of things. The grass rendering is less dense in like the opening field when you walk down that initial path to the that first boss on the horseback. It's hard to recommend 100%, but if you want a 60 FPS game out of Elden Ring, and I think a lot of people would value that given how much smoother it feels this way, then this is the way to do it. It's by far the best way on PlayStation 5. And if you've got no VR supporting display, and say you've got all the next-gen consoles, PS5 offers a solution there.
That is actually the smoothest way to play it right now, even over the PC version. So you're essentially sacrificing visual quality for it. But there's some caveats here as well, in the sense that, unfortunately, if you buy the disc, the PS5 disc, you don't get access to the PS4 Pro version.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is a huge bummer. But also, I don't think you've actually done this because you're using the digital version, but it is possible if you have the Xbox disc, you can use the Xbox One X version. There's a way around this that has been discovered.
Yeah.
The issue there is that you have to play it in offline mode, otherwise it tries to install the Series X version. And online is a part of the game, admittedly. And also, unlike the PS4 Pro running on PS5, it doesn't completely fix the frame rate. Like, I saw some things going around where people were showing the LG frame rate readout, but they were in 120 hertz mode. So if the frame rate goes under like 120 on that, it's actually technically under 60. And that's what's going on here. So you still get VRR. The average frame rate on the One X does seem slightly higher when running on Series X, but it's not significant enough to the point where I would say you should use that version.
I mean, in either case, it would be nice to just have an option to revert to even basic last-gen settings, a true performance mode, if you like, but we haven't actually got that.
That's true, exactly. So I think we should talk a little bit about settings real quick, because obviously, as you noted, you lose some detail when using the last-gen version, right? But what about between quality and performance mode itself? Is there anything worth mentioning besides resolution?
Well, the resolution side, obviously. You go to dynamic resolutions when you switch to the frame rate mode, and then you fix to 4K on PS5 and Series X in the quality modes, or 1440p on the Series S's quality mode. So you add dynamic resolution when you switch to the frame rate mode. That's point number one. Point number two is a lower shadow setting on all consoles when you switch to the frame rate mode. Just means a setting lower than whatever they were running at on the quality mode. Series S happens to just be running a lower setting anyway compared to Series X and PS5, so it goes a rung even lower than that. So you end up with some very blurry shadows in that case, and none of them are all that great in the first place. I think shadows are not the strong suit for Elden Ring. Yeah, other than that, we picked up on the issue of motion blur, which is point number 3. Motion blur is the other big difference.
Yeah, and this is a big one. So the Souls games have always used per pixel motion blur to accentuate animation, and I'm a big fan of it. But in this case, if you're using quality mode, you get motion blur all the time, which is nice. But
yeah,
in performance mode, people were noting, why is it absent in this version or not absent in this version? Well, it turns out it's actually variable. They sort of flip it on for certain sequences, but then disable it usually when you're out in the open world. But it's not as cut and dry as I expected. Like on the first boss, PS5 and Xbox, you get motion blur in performance mode or frame rate mode. But on Series S, you don't. And so I'm really wondering like how they decide to enable or disable motion blur in that mode. Like I assume it's maybe based on the load, but it does seem to be, it's strange, wouldn't you say?
I would say, yeah. Like in the open worlds, it seems to disappear on the frame rate mode. On PS5, and definitely on Xbox Series X, and definitely on Series S, it's completely absent. In bosses like Margit the Fell, it's almost like it keeps, because the motion blur switches on for the cutscenes, and right after the cutscene, it maybe retains the motion blur as a result of being in a cutscene where it's enabled. But it's not clear. Like some scenes it'll appear, and others it won't.
Yeah, it's variable. Again, playing on Series X, I've noticed that in general, motion blur seems to be disabled.
Yeah.
It occasionally turns on, and for the reason, but it's usually not there. But let's quickly go over the summary of the situation here. It is kind of as we posted the other day, really. If you want the most stable frame rate, PS4 Pro on PS5 is the way to do it. But you lose some visual quality because you're getting checkerboard 1800p. You lose sort of the grass settings. They're slightly reduced. And then the shadows are pretty grimy, I have to say. But honestly, for that fluidity, it's a really good option. Now, if you own an Xbox, and one of the new Xboxes I should specify specifically, and you have a display capable of VRR, that is the other great option. And that's actually, as I said, the option that I went with, because I do think that sort of saves the day and the game ends up feeling quite good. But if you don't have such a display, the actual average frame rate is not great, and it's slightly worse than PS5. But that's not to say PS5 native is great either, because it is also always under 60 FPS during most gameplay situations. So it's either VRR with Xbox or PS4 Pro on PS5 if you want a stable frame rate. Otherwise, it is what it is. But there is another point to test, I think, and this one is kind of puzzling, a little disappointing, and it's the loading times, right?
Well, in the network test, we saw PS5 was already ahead, and it was loading areas much faster. Obviously, we've got respawning after tough bosses. We've got fast travel right from the start, pretty much. It's a core part of the gameplay loop, which is why it's so glaring to have long loading times in a game like this. Now, Series X and S aren't bad at all. I think you've been playing Xbox mostly, and you've had an okay time of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that bad actually compared to some of the older Souls games. It's completely playable. You'll notice it, but I don't think it's like bad or anything. It's just I feel like it could be faster.
But yes, Xbox Series S and X are slower than PS5 by quite a margin. If that matters to you, then this is a factor here. It's about sometimes almost 3 times slower. But still, it's faster than the last gen versions, which we'll test, in the coming week.
On average, I would say it seems to vary between 10 and 20 seconds, somewhere in that window on Xbox, depending on where you're loading from. And then PS5 then seems to be in the 4 to 7 second range usually.
Worth noting that it is a bit slower than the network test as well, like on the Xbox consoles, but I've also kind of rationalized that the network test had less data to load in, like areas weren't fully fleshed out. Obviously, it's a smaller profile install, and yeah, it was still work in progress, so that makes total sense in a weird way. It's only like 2 to 3 seconds slower on the new final build. Speaking of which, Bloodborne did actually improve those loading times with a patch, so they're on it.
That's true. Well, yeah, that's the only time they've actually managed to fix something. And even then, it wasn't like night and day, I would say. But you keep mentioning the network test, and this is actually something that's really interesting because, with all the talk about the day one patch and then we had the network test, you kind of would have expected some things to improve, right? Because it's been several months since then. But in the end, not only has it not really improved, it's actually kind of slower in many ways, isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't really have tested this if it wasn't for the fact we were, delayed from covering the game just to cover patch 1.02. So we really wanted to see, okay, what is actually the difference, expecting some margin of improvement, but it's actually slower. Frame rates are worse on the final release, even fully patched. It can vary. It's like a margin of sometimes 3 frames per second, just emerging to Limgrave. In cutscenes, quite a bit more so. So here we've got like the PS5 version, network test on left and the final release on right. This is the quality mode. And yeah, you can see it's a pretty consistent margin all the way through. It's quite striking.
But honestly, because the network test performance was already disappointing, the fact that it's actually worse is really... It's not great. It's not a good look.
I've got another bit of news for you as well.
Tell me.
The shadows. Notice as we come out of Limgrave,
okay,
out to the open world, that the shadow draw distance on these trees here completely reined in there.
Wow, it looks like it's actually less detailed in the final game.
Just shadows. It looks like they've added a pass of mist in this opening shot, which is a nice artistic touch. But On like a technical level across, I've done loads of comparison shots here, and you can see pretty much in every single one, the shadows just don't draw in as close to the camera as they previously did in the network test. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't think on its own, in isolation, you're really going to notice, but it's kind of interesting to see how they've tweaked and optimized the game, and it hasn't really helped the frame rate in any way either, so kind of a shame.
What a strange situation, I gotta say. So, we've had a lot to say about the technology here and sort of the issues that we faced, because it is disappointing that it runs the way it does. But I will say, despite that, and maybe it's because I'm playing the Xbox version, which, again, VRR, man, that's we need that on the PS5 as well, I think, because it is a game changer. The game itself, though, I think is phenomenal.
Oh yeah, incredible.
I do think maybe the reviews could have stood to have mentioned some of the technical issues more so, like we're doing now, but the actual core game design is so good. I mean, it really is. It's a Souls game, though, right? If you don't like those games, you're not going to like this. But I think it's less punishing because, one, there's no like hollowed state like in the Souls games. There's more flexibility in terms of the build that you can do. And, if you get to the first boss, you're struggling, there's a whole gigantic area to explore and many other things to find. And this is what's key, because as I've said many times, what I don't love about open world games is when they turn into the checklist, where you have a map full of icons, you have a log full of things to do, and it just turns into this feeling of just running across maps, sort of mindlessly slashing things, just dealing with enemies. None of it really matters, and you're just trying to tick off the boxes so you can see the next story sequence or whatever. It doesn't have that. I was really worried about this because one of the appeals of From Software games has always been this sense of like exploration, even within a limited environment. They were always more Metroid-ish than anything else. And by that, I just mean, lots of branching paths, lots of interconnectivity between environments. Your level, essentially, and your capabilities sort of act as the key, whether you can get through certain areas. And that was very satisfying because it was challenging enough that it really pushes you to learn and explore and figure out how to play. And that actually does translate to this full open world. Usually in open world games, it's just like open terrain. I don't remember most of the areas, right? You'll remember the towns or certain specific spots, but just running across a field's a field. Even in great games like The Witcher 3, like I don't think that many of those fields are that interesting. It's just set dressing, ultimately, for me at least. Here, though, when you cross a bridge for the first time, or you're going through a certain field or exploring a certain ruin, like because of that danger and the meticulous nature of the enemy placement and the way that the challenges are designed, it gives it a tension, and it's much more thrilling to explore. And because it's not all laid out in this giant checklist of things, you actually get that sense of exploration back. Like when you find a cave here, there was no indication that it was there. There's no reason why it's there. And you'll find weird, surprising things down there sometimes. You never know what to expect. You just know that there's going to be all you expect is the unexpected.
That's definitely the magic. And I agree. It feels like the anti-Ubisoft game in so many ways. It rewards you for branching out on your own path, and it can often, end perilously for you. It usually will, and I love that. I love that every corner of this world is... I can go in one direction, and it'll feel like I know this spot just without a map or, a guiding golden trail or anything. I can just, by eye, figure out, okay, my location is here, without having to revert to the map, which is there now. And it is to the credit of the world design that every structure in the game feels so visually unique. It kind of sits in your mind a little easier.
Yeah, and the sense of scale is great too. But I think the real key here is that, when you're exploring in a lot of games and you're getting loot, it usually doesn't matter that much, right? It's just...
But here, oh my god, it does.
But because the game is challenging, actually exploring and finding things can have a serious impact on your abilities and allow you to conquer situations you were previously stuck at. You don't even know what you're going to find out there, but sometimes, a random item or a shopkeeper or something that you just didn't expect or that you would need is there. and now you have a leg up.
Yeah, it makes your journey completely unique to anyone else's. Just because you found this rare item in the church to the northeast or whatever, there was no signposting any of the way, which makes it all the more satisfying. I think on a very general level, this year has already had so many Game of the Year contenders within the first few months. So the Elden Rings, every bit worth the wait that we've had to endure for it. And I'm so glad we have it, even in the state it's in. With the performance side, it says a lot that we can ignore a lot of that stuff.
I won't say I've been able to ignore it. It was very frustrating settling on it, but thankfully, I found a way to enjoy it thanks to VRR. But
yeah, there are workarounds, and less so for PC. Obviously, Alex has gone into detail about that, but the stuttering on PC is pretty hard to overlook right now, and that I think From Software has issued a statement about that. Thankfully, to say they're looking at it. But for console, there's been no word whatsoever in terms of their latest updates about what's going to happen with the new patch.
Which really, it makes you wonder if they even have the capacity to fix this. Obviously, you can do 60 FPS in this game on a PS5, right? We know that. It's
proven.
It's adjusting the settings correctly. And they obviously have things set up in such a way that it just can't get there natively. So Xbox and PS5 should be able to deliver a locked 60 in this game, I feel.
That's the most frustrating part.
Come on, guys.
Well, I think that's as good a note as any to end it on. We've covered everything we need to cover, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're going to go back to playing Elden Ring, but thank you so much for joining me, John, on this one.
Of course, Tom. And thanks for doing all that hard work and capture.
It's been a long week, and there's more to come. I think we're doing the last gen versions next, so
yep.
Look out for that.
Don't worry, we're going to cover the last gen versions.
Yep.
It'll happen.
We're not leaving you behind. All right, well, from me and John, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.